He goes through a series of events that help to demonstrate this idea, which I encourage you to go take a look at. Okay, and then the last two papers are about the social construction of hegemonic masculinity through two specific actions, those of sport and those of violence. Okay, so the paper by Drummond on sport goes through a number of different sports and studies not just the conceptions of masculinity by people who practice these sports, but how it also affects their relationship with people in their lives. So I thought this was really interesting. So the idea here is, of course, that boys are socialized through organized competitive sport to be initiated into, right, this sort of manly identity, to help build that manly identity, and then later on to help affirm it, right? So you're being initiated into it, typically through a series of, maybe difficult times at the beginning, or maybe you get especially bad treatment, right, that we associate with different types of initiation. Then again, by participating in these sports with other men, you're seen as building certain skills that you need to be a man. And then again, when later on in life someone embodies those characteristics, that helps to affirm their manly character, right? And so this affects not just their values, but also their attitudes and skill sets. And so this dominant masculine body is seen as primarily three things, according to this study. It's seen as being tough, it's seen as being superior to women's bodies, and unfortunately it's seen as being violent. And so according to Drummond, this combines misogyny with heteronormativity and homophobia. And his study found that this negatively affects men's relationships with women, fathers, their peers, and other men, by promoting personal health and well-being crises. So he goes over in his examples surf lifesavers, triathletes, and bodybuilders. And I was especially taken by the bodybuilding example, just because one of my friends was in a relationship with a bodybuilder as they entered into that field, and it was really interesting to see the values of the bodybuilding community change, not just him, but the way he was approaching their relationship, right? So by placing an emphasis on your physical look, right, it encouraged him to be much more superficial, right, to be much more concerned about looks, writ large, and thus to actually serve to undermine any insecurity that he might have had in his looks before, because now all of a sudden the value of your looks is only determined by someone else, right? The judges in this case, or whatever the standards are of that society. So some really interesting examples here. Perhaps you can relate some of them to your own life as well. So the last paper is probably the most traumatizing of the week. Lots of different examples by Kenway, Fitzclarence, and Hasluck describing different instances of violence that have taken place primarily in the workforce that have been used again to reinforce this notion of hegemonic masculinity. So we're looking here at all male groups and how they identify themselves, right, and how that tends to, again, reinforce this idea. So all male group identification, according to these authors, involves devaluing and contempt for the feminine, right? So the idea is that when we see groups of just men together, they tend to identify themselves in opposition to what it means to be feminine, and not just in opposition to, but with a sort of hatred or contempt, right? Looking down upon this other. And the idea, again, is that that can create an anxiety and insecurity about one's own identity if, again, you secretly do identify with anything like that, right? Because then you are afraid of showing that in the group, right? If those things are being devalued and held with contempt for, then of course there's going to be a form of policing by the group against any forms of femininity, and then attempts to purge those elements of femininity if they are found, right? So the group, right, through power and boundary maintenance, is going to try to police and purge any notions of femininity, right? So this will be if there is, any leader of the group, but also who is allowed to be a participant, right? So maintaining those boundaries, not being exclusionary, not letting people in. But also, again, through oneself, right? Through the hostility towards subordinated males and insubordinate females, right? So the idea is that if individuals in that group have or maybe identify with any of those things, that's going to be at odds with what the group is expecting. And so that can create hostility for individuals in themselves, which they might then take out on those around them, right? To try to make themselves feel better about the persona that they're performing, right? So again, these authors are going to expand upon Drummond's work and find that it not only involves misogyny and homophobia, but also includes elements of racism, classism, and age discrimination, right? So again, I would think a lot of people could relate to, hopefully not the more violent instances accounted in this paper, but I think just the idea of facing a group that has existed, coming into that as an outsider, and navigating the personal politics, right? That you have to perform in a certain way to fit in, right? To be treated well, right? This can have all sorts of implications. So I encourage you to explore, examples that you can think of in your own life that help to elaborate on these ideas. But the overall conclusion is that this produces sex-based harassment and violence. What's interesting, though, is that it's often portrayed as if it's a game or sport itself, right? And so this goes back to some of those like sexist remarks, homophobic remarks, racist remarks, where people say like, oh, you're taking things too seriously, you need to lighten up, right? So by putting it in the form of something humorous, it allows these groups to get away with it, even when these instances of violence are reported to higher